These logically completes questions are very important places to pay attention to strong words, not only in the answer choices, but in the story itself, since that's kind of the point. We need to finish this story, so we need to be able to sense as we're reading it where it's going. And this one does seem kind of long, but let's make sure we kind of focus on the right things as we go. The eastern oyster was once abundant in the waters around New York City, so much so that it was a common item on local restaurant menus through the first half of the 19th century, when oyster populations saw significant decline due to overharvesting and increased pollution. So, okay, you could focus on some things, right? They were once abundant, now they're in decline. Marine biologist Brandy Shaw and colleagues conducted a long-term research study that measured the eastern oyster population in a segment of the Hudson River near New York City, finding an inverse correlation, that's really important, between oyster numbers and precipitation amounts during the winter months. Why is inverse correlation important? Because it is telling me a relationship. And there's lots of words kind of similar to those that can tell me different kinds of relationships, but I bet that that's going to matter somehow in this story. So let's keep reading. And I'll dumb summarize it later, but for now I want to keep going. So they speculated that winters with higher snowfall totals saw an increase in the amount of road salt runoff entering the Hudson River, which could have a detrimental impact on the eastern oyster's life cycle. So just increase kind of goes along with inverse correlation, another one of those relationship words. Then, as always, one of our most important words probably the most important word in any passage is the word but. However is just another word for but. So this probably matters quite a bit here. Let's see what it says. However, after New York City discontinued using road salt in 2017, Shaw and her colleagues did not see a statistically significant change in eastern oyster population patterns suggesting that. Okay. So I still barely understand what I'm reading here. This is very complicated, but notice the words I've highlighted are all words that kind of understand the relationship. Nowhere in this process did I underline the phrase eastern oyster, because it's all about the oysters. Like, I don't need to know that. I don't need to remember that. I'm not going to get confused and think, oh, suddenly we're talking about crabs. Like, it's clearly about this. So it's what we're saying about those things that matters most. So it does seem that there's some sort of kind of summary or so let's call it a dumb summary. All right, so let's pull out a dumb summary here. Let's get some space. So a dumb summary of this piece is an inverse correlation between oyster numbers and precipitation. So more precipitation equals fewer oysters. That's what inverse means. As one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. So that's why that's such a strong phrase, is if we didn't notice that, then we might be completely confused about what we're trying to get across. They do say next, they speculate winters with higher snowfall total, so more precipitation, so an increase in the amount of road salt runoff. So, okay, increase in precipitation also means an increase in the road salt. So there's a inverse correlation and what we might think of as a positive correlation as well. The precipitation and the salt are kind of both going in the same direction, so those are positively correlated. Okay, then we get to the however, discontinued using road salt. So this is basically saying the road salt doesn't matter, because then did not see a statistically significant change. So if they're saying the precipitation has to do with the road salt, and the road salt then is what's dealing, kind of working against the oyster populations, then if they did not see a statistically significant change in the oysters when the road salt stopped getting used, then the road salt didn't matter. That's kind of my big takeaway here. So I'm honestly, like, I could probably fill in the blank here. I think it's going to say something like suggesting that the salt doesn't matter, something like that. A lot of my dumb summaries come down to whether or not something matters or not, and other types of increases and decreases. So I don't know. Let's just see what we get here. Which choice most logically completes the text? So suggesting that the fluctuations in eastern oyster populations could be caused by pollutants other than those commonly found in road salt. Okay, that's basically a fancy way of saying it's not the road salt. So, salt doesn't matter. I'll just put not salt so it's shorter. Right now, did they talk about other pollutants? No, but we're completing the story. And a lot of times with these questions, we're finishing the story with information that's not directly stated earlier in the story, but follows logically from it. So if they're saying it's not the road salt, then something else could be getting into the water and killing the oysters. Maybe. I don't know. Let's move on. I don't have a sense of this, but I also don't really have any strong words in this choice that I don't know that really bother me. Are they talking about fluctuations in eastern oyster populations? Yeah, fluctuations just means changes. We're trying to find the cause. They're saying it's not road salt. I mean, this choice is not really saying much else. So let's look at B. The amount of road salt runoff is one of many factors influencing the population of eastern oysters. Well, okay, road salt, one of many factors. So this is saying it is salt, right? This is saying the salt matters, right? So we said salt doesn't matter. This is saying the salt does matter. It's one of many factors. But the whole point of the end of this story, the however, where the strong word really kind of told us to pay attention, the whole point of that is saying the road salt didn't matter. So maybe there are other factors, but the point of this is supposed to be that road salt is not one of them. So this is saying the opposite of what we wanted to say. But I think if you kind of like didn't notice that this part right here is really strong and important, you might think that B is actually the answer, because a lot of this passage, more of this passage than the end, is about the road salt mattering. And so we might get kind of confused and think that that's what they're arguing, but it's just not where this story ends. This however is there, and this is why you got to really pay attention to words that have a contrast, like a but. Let's look at C. Year-to-year variation in winter precipitation totals does not affect eastern oyster populations regardless of the volume of road salt runoff. Well, I do like that regardless of the salt. So this saying salt does not matter. I got to find shorter ways to write this. But year-to-year variation winter precipitation totals does not affect eastern oyster populations. We didn't really go that far, right? We attacked this part of the dumb summary, but we didn't really attack this part of the top, right? The precipitation seems to matter. I mean, in fact, they don't, if we go back, right, what do they say about the precipitation? Brandy Shaw and colleagues conducted a long-term research study that measured the population, finding an inverse correlation between oyster numbers and precipitation amounts. Later, when the however comes in, they're not saying that that study was wrong, that there is no correlation between the precipitation and the oysters. They're just saying that there's this intermediate thing, the road salts, that isn't quite right. So maybe the precipitation and the oysters, they still are correlated, but there's something else in between that we don't understand. So I think C is a little tempting, but it's going too far, right? The precipitation does not affect it. That's very different from saying the road salt, it's not affected. I'll leave it in just to compare it to A at the end, but I think A is still better. D, more time must pass before the study can accurately measure the effect of road salt runoff in the Hudson River. No, they said that we have evidence that the road salt doesn't matter, right? So this is kind of the same as this one. The road salt doesn't matter. More time is not going to reveal another change in circumstances. They're telling us that the road salt stopped and that didn't affect the oysters. So the road salt doesn't matter. We don't need to wait longer. So again, back to A and C. I think it's A. The fluctuations in eastern oyster populations could be caused by pollutants other than those commonly found in road salt. Right, that's just basically saying road salt doesn't matter. C is saying road salt doesn't matter, but it's also saying the precipitation doesn't matter. That's stronger, right? And so this also helps when we are maybe using our dumb summary as a bit of a filter, right? We're trying to look for choices that say something like salt doesn't matter. A and C pass through the filter. A and C work in that simple, dumb way. But then if we look at what I would think of it as a wedge, right? We're trying to split these choices apart, right? And we're trying to say, okay, what's the difference in A and C? They're similar. They both hit the same idea, but they must have something that makes them different. This is, again, where strong words come in. I think this is a weaker choice because it only makes one point, the point about the road salt. This is a stronger choice because it makes that point about the road salt and adds in a point about the precipitation, and we don't have any evidence about the precipitation thing. But even if I was totally confused about the passage, weaker choices on the SAT tend to be better. And this is why when we talk about strong words, there are certain words that should pop out to us. And then overall, a sentence can have, or a choice rather, can have kind of like a really strong point that it's making or a weaker point that it's making. And that's always kind of what we're trying to determine and compare. So it's tricky. There's no set science to it. But with practice, you can get good at noticing what choices are strong and weak, what words are strong and weak. And especially as you read these kind of dense, long passages, there are certain words that need to pop out to you. However is a big one, but also anything that talks about relationships, increases, decreases, correlations. You got to pay attention to that stuff. Odds are very good. That's exactly what the question is about.